Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Covidence Thought Leadership webinar. We're so glad that you could join us today for our panel discussion, which is going to be focusing on top tips for effective systematic review data extraction. My name is Nancy Owens, and I'm Covidence's head of community management. I work with Covidence's global team of community managers to support Covidence users in every aspect of using Covidence to support their research work. Today's webinar is about the process of doing data extraction generally, rather than about how to make specific decisions on methodology or how to use Covidence or any other software platform to complete this process. Many of you will be aware that Covidence is in the final stages of redesigning and relaunching the data extraction section of our platform. Once that's live, we will be offering training on how to use those new features in conjunction with the work that you may be doing. For today, however, we're going to be focusing on sharing information to help understand the process better and how to work with your review team to complete it efficiently. Just a few other housekeeping details before I introduce our panelists today. First, this session will be recorded and will be publicly available about 24 hours after it ends. And as you're registered to attend, you will automatically receive a link to that recording as soon as it's available. Second, all webinar attendees are muted, but please feel free at any point in the presentation to type questions and comments into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be sharing those questions with our speakers in the chat box throughout the webinar as relevant to the topics, and we'll be discussing those as we work through the list of tips. We'll also review any questions that we don't have time to answer after the session is over, and we'll share responses and additional resources after the fact. This webinar is definitely intended to be a peer-to-peer knowledge sharing experience, as well as getting information from our panelists. So we do welcome any insights from the community as well as your questions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. First, I'd like to welcome Nicola Mayan, who is one of Covidence's community managers. Hello, Nicola, and welcome.
Hi, Nancy. Thanks for having me.
Nicola is based in London, and she supports Covidence's global user community with her knowledge and expertise of systematic reviews on a daily basis. Prior to joining Covidence, Nicola was a consultant systematic reviewer for more than 10 years, working on systematic reviews on mental health, vaccines, and infectious diseases. She's an author on more than 20 published reviews, as well as a contributor to multiple WHO guidelines. Her experiences encompasses both intervention and diagnostic test accuracy reviews. We're also joined by Susan Wheeland, who is an assistant professor of family and community medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in the US. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Nancy.
She's been associated with Cochrane since 2001 and currently leads the Cochrane Complementary Medicine field, which supports Cochrane systematic reviews on complementary and alternative medicine topics such as herbal medicines and yoga, among many other topics. Susan has led several Cochrane and non-Cochrane reviews on complementary and conventional topics and has extensive experience in systematic review methodology of interventions. Thank you both so much for being here today to explore this topic with the community.
Thank you.
Thanks.
As we get underway, we're going to be sharing some polls with you. We're really interested in your input and experience on various topics that we're going to be covering today relevant to doing systematic reviews. So I'm now going to launch our first poll to gather information from you about what your experiences are. And you should now be able to see our first poll question, which is relevant to your current level of data extraction. DE in brackets expertise. We'll probably be mentioning DE as well as data extraction, so you're aware of that abbreviation. We're interested to learn more about your current level of experience and involvement. So please click on the choice that best describes your situation, including if you're here because you are not necessarily doing it yourself, but you are supporting other people. And while we're giving people some time to respond to that, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the agenda. So the agenda for today is that we've structured this session around a series of tips for managing the data extraction process. We've identified what we consider to be the top tips in consultation with the Covidence user community, many of whom have been talking to our team over the past couple of months as we've been looking at ways of improving what we do here at Covidence around data extraction. And we took the information we'd learned from the community and discussed it with the community management team as well as today's panelists. We're going to discuss each of these, and we're going to be sharing some additional poll questions to gather more information from you about your experiences. And as I said earlier, you'll also have the opportunity to ask questions about these and to share feedback. So I am now going to go ahead and close the poll, and that should put the results up on screen. So we've got an interesting spread here. We've got lots of people in the top 2. So it looks like we've got probably the majority. I'm going to try to do math on the fly, but it looks like more than 70% of the people who are participating today have never really done it, or they've done it before, but are looking for some additional guidance. So that's pretty interesting, and I'm hoping we're going to be able to provide some useful information to help you tackle this process with more confidence. I'm going to go ahead and hide those results, and I'm going to move us on, and we're going to start talking about our first tip. And that is the first tip that we've heard from many, many people and that we know ourselves from our own experience is to have a plan for your data extraction process before you begin. This can range from a basic outline to a published peer-reviewed protocol. If you define your inclusion and exclusion criteria of how you're going to be handling your process before beginning screening, this is a good way to help establish parameters of the data that you'll be collecting. And I'm now going to turn to our panel and get their input and their experiences of tackling this map, setting up a map that's going to help you through the data extraction and analysis process. So I'm going to start with Susan. If you could tell us a little bit about how this works in your experience and thinking through what kinds of questions teams should be asking to develop a thorough and effective plan or protocol.
Sure, Nancy, thank you. So yeah, I definitely think about the protocol as a map to where I want to end up. And, if you don't know where you're going to have a long and inefficient trip to somewhere that maybe you didn't even really intend to go. So the things you need to think about are what you're going to want to report and analyze in your review. So for example, the information you'll need to carry out in your analyses. So for example, pain, but thinking in detail about what you might encounter along the way with pain. So there are many different measures of pain. You might have a preferred measure that you consider more valid than another. So you might sort of rank that you'll take one over another if you have multiple options. So for example, a review I did of acupuncture for osteoarthritis, there's a very standard pain outcome in arthritis, and we pre-specified in our protocol we would use this one, and then if it didn't exist, we'd use another one that's often used in the topic area. And if that didn't work, then we'd use, simple pain scale on a 1 to 10 measure. So you also need to think, in addition to your main outcomes, you need to think about if you're going to carry out subgroup analyses, that you've pulled out the information you need to do this. So for example, if you're going to look at subgroups by baseline blood levels of vitamin D, make sure you extract this information from the study. Even though you're not doing an analysis on baseline blood levels of vitamin D, you're going to need this for one of your analyses. And then the other thing you're going to need to think about is just everything else your readers are going to need or want to know about your included studies in order to make sense of it. So, very standard items like age, sex, the setting of the study, and also additional information that lets them understand sort of more about the studies in the review. So for example, I read a massage review that defined massage quite broadly and found, I don't know, it was a dozen studies. And not all the massage studies they had found would necessarily be what I might think of as like Swedish massage. Some of them were like, you know, pressing a pressure point on the foot or on the hand. So collecting that kind of information so that people who read the review can understand, oh, it's not, you know, we're not just talking Swedish massage, we're talking about other things, largely or in addition. And then the other thing I'll just say is that something I found useful is looking at other systematic reviews on the same topic. And, you know, during the protocol stage, when you're planning and thinking ahead, it can be really useful to use standardized outcomes that are suggested by a research society or that are reported. I've done a yoga review on urinary incontinence for the Cochrane Incontinence Group, and we deliberately included outcomes that are in other Cochrane reviews for the same indication so that people who are going to look across reviews can easily compare the findings of the different reviews or combine them for the same condition. So that's just sort of a bonus tip that I've found useful.
Thank you. That's really useful. And one of the things that you mentioned, I think, ties into the next question, which is to Nicola, which is how might what happens during the screening process, even if you've already started laying out what your plan or your protocol is going to be, in your experience, are there things that might happen during screening that might affect your plans for the data extraction process, and how do you handle those?
Yeah, so I think with the how the screening might affect your data extraction process would be making sure that you are really screening your studies fully in the data extraction process. I think it can be quite easy sometimes to get very sort of focused on the participants and the intervention when you're doing your full text screening. And I think it's really important to actually remember that the outcomes is one of your inclusion criteria and stay focused on that while you're screening, because you don't want to get to a point where you've included lots of studies that fit, you know, the participants, the intervention, the control, and then you're midway through your data extraction of that paper, and then you realize, oh, actually these outcomes are not ones that we've pre-specified, and it therefore shouldn't be included, because you'll end up wasting some time if you're doing that. So I would definitely encourage you to really ensure that your included studies are included at the screening process so you can confidently move forward with your data extraction in a timely way.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would also echo Susan's comments about, you know, the really using your protocol as your map and not getting distracted, because you will come across studies that will be included, but maybe they only report one outcome of interest, and they might report many other outcomes that answer their question but are not relevant for your review. So I would say just keep mindful of that and don't get distracted by maybe what other authors on studies are focused on your question.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, when I do a review, I will include things if they're looking at pain, even if they don't report a pain outcome. I still think it's important to include them in the review. But I have a lot of trouble when I pre-specify that participants have to be followed up for a certain amount of time. And then often in the screening process, I'll miss that. I'll be like, oh no, they didn't follow them up for, you know, they didn't give them treatment for at least 1 month. I guess that has to go away. So yeah, there are all sorts of things you need to think about at screening. It's not totally straightforward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we've got one clarification question that one of our participants has asked, which is, by setting of the study, are you referring to location or country, or are you referring to something more like clinical or home-based setting when you're talking about setting?
So I would say both. I would say it's very standard to think about what country the trial is set in. And then depending on the question, you might think about, is it clinical or community? For some interventions, it would always be clinical. Some it would always be community. Sometimes it might depend, what level of clinical care people are in, primary or secondary. So it really depends on what the end users are going to need to understand in order to make sense of the findings of the review and what evidence went in to that review.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to now move us on so that we stay on track with time. I'm going to move us on to tip number 2, and that is set up a process to pilot your plan. Doing this provides an opportunity not only to test out what you're proposed to do and to make sure it's working, but also gives the team an opportunity to work together and make sure everyone understands the process. And I'm going to take this opportunity to post another poll question to tell us what you may have done previously about piloting in your reviews. And I will just say that the options for the poll only include how many studies you piloted. So if you have not run a pilot previously, please just answer that you have done the first option, which is fewer than 5. I'm going to launch that now. And while that is running, I'm going to ask the next follow-up question on this to Nicola, which is, in your experience, what are some kinds of things that the team might encounter during a pilot process?
So yeah, during a pilot, you're going to have a certain number of studies that you and your co-reviewer are going to be testing out your data extraction form. So one thing that you might find when you're doing that is that perhaps you want to check how clearly your form is written and that everybody understands the questions in the same way. So you may find that you're interpreting items differently. A good example is the setting like we just discussed. So it's good to really clarify those things so that all reviewers are on the same page. I would also encourage during the data extraction pilot to pilot it all the way through to putting your data into your analysis, into whatever statistical program you might be using. I think it's hugely important. One of my earlier reviews that I worked on, it was a very complex review with lots of outcomes, lots of data, and we built this huge data extraction form that really covered everything. But unfortunately, we hadn't piloted it all the way through to the analysis. And when we got to that stage, we realized, oh, hang on, this is not easy to add to our statistical program. So we ended up spending a lot of time reorganizing the data. So I would say that's definitely an important step to come up to focus on as well.
Okay, thank you. I've now closed the poll and I'm going to share the results, and we'll be able to see that the vast majority of people have piloted fewer than 5 studies, which means they've either done a very small number or they haven't run a pilot previously. And that kind of leads into the next question, which I'm going to ask Susan, which is, in your experience, or what do you think, or how do you establish what the best size is for a pilot process? And does that vary depending upon the topic or the size of the project that you're working on?
Yeah, I would say it depends on a few different factors. A major factor is the size of the review itself. So right now I'm working on a review with 5 randomized controlled trials. So if I were to pilot 5 or decide I want to pilot 10, that would be a vast over use of my co-author's time. So for example, my review where I have 5 studies, I have one co-author who's working with me on the data extraction, so I'm piloting it on a single study. Then I'm having her check the extracted information on the participants, interventions, comparators, other information. And I'm going to be asking her to do the numerical data extraction. And then at the end of that process, we'll discuss whether there's anything missing or unclear or the form needs revision. But if you have a larger number of included trials, or you or your co-authors are less experienced, or you have more different co-authors that you're working with, you might want to pilot with more studies. So in a review with a dozen trials, I might begin with 2 or 3 I mean, I think the important thing is to use the pilot to make sure that you're capturing the information you need to. The protocol and the data extraction form allow the extraction to be consistent across data extractors, and the pilot is just an iterative process to get you to that point.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to move us forward to tip number, oh, hang on a second. I'm just double checking. Okay, we've got a time for a question from the audience. So what if during the extraction process, some interesting findings are spotted, but they do not belong to any planned criteria? Any recommendations to avoid this at the planning stage? And if it happens, what is the best strategy for it?
So this actually just happened to me recently. So I think it depends what you mean by interesting. If it's something that's really relevant and key that you didn't have in your protocol or in your data extraction form, you're going to want to put it in and document that it's a change from your protocol. So I'm looking at a prevention trial, and I decided I would look at how many people got the infection. That's one test of whether or not prevention works. And the other thing was severity of the disease. And then I came across duration of the disease episode in one of the studies. I was like, duh, I should have thought of that. So, I mean, it's really key. It's not exactly the same as severity, but it really should be in there. And so I went and put it in, and I'm just documenting in my protocol, which included a draft data extraction, that I added it. Again, it's less of a problem if you have few studies than if you have a mass of studies. And, you know, maybe Nicholas had more experience with that.
Yeah, I think I agree with Susan there. If it's something that stands out and you're like, oh yeah, this is actually a really key important finding, there is the ability to make it and document a change to your protocol. So, you know, you can do that. I think if it's just if it's an interesting piece of information that they found that isn't directly answering your question, but is related to the topic and can influence maybe your interpretation of the results, I would certainly make a note of it. Perhaps you can include that in your discussion towards the end of your review. So that's a great place to put additional information that's interesting, but not directly related to the question.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move us forward again to tip number 3. And tip number 3 is document, document, document. So as you will have picked up from what Susan and Nicola have already been saying, this is a really key part of the process as you put your plan into practice, to document exactly what you're doing. It enables you and your team to be transparent, and it makes it more likely that if someone else were to try to replicate what you've done, that they'd be able to get the same answer, which is, of course, excellent in practice in doing any kind of research. And they've just been providing us with some real world examples of things that you might want to be documenting, particularly if they're a change in what you were anticipating was going to happen when you started out with your plan. So how does this, so this question's for Susan, or to start off with Susan. So how does this work? If you're communicating about things, you know, with your co-reviewers during the process, if you're documenting information, you find things that you think need to be recorded. People are very mindful during systematic reviews about not introducing bias into the process. What do you think is a key or keys to communicating during the process without introducing bias?
Well, I think if you have a good protocol and sort of plan, then people can work independently according to that plan. And if they document their work and including their rationale for any decisions they might have made that might not be obvious choices, then after they've done this, they've come up with their decisions and they have their rationale, then they discuss with their reviewers, their co-authors, and can reach consensus. So again, it comes back to the the plan and not subverting the plan by, you know, going into a huddle and saying, well, what do you think? Should we do this or should we do that? I don't know. This is significant and that's not. So as long as you follow your plan, including the parts of the plan that ask you to work independently and on data extraction or to check somebody else's data extraction, then I think you should be fine.
Yeah, I would agree with Susan on that, but I would also add that there's, as long as you're doing it independently and documenting your rationale and decision making, you don't have to leave the consensus stage till after you've done your whole data extraction. You can say we'll do the same five papers and then we'll do the consensus. So it's a way of just sort of almost continuing that pilot process and just checking that you still are on the same page and, you know, discussing studies while it's fresh in your mind, especially if you're working on a really large review. If you leave the consensus all the way to the end, you can find yourself having to get your brain back into that study and reread it many times and remind yourself why you did things. So yeah, that can be quite a good tactic for approaching it. As long as you're doing it, as Susan says, independently, then that's fine to move on to the consensus once that's done.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, if you're checking in intermittently, it's almost like an extension of the pilot process that you're just sort of keeping each other on the same page, so to speak. And it's much more efficient.
And the second follow-up that I had is somewhat related to this, because this is something that I think comes up regularly and is something that different teams handle in different ways, and that is when you actually start implementing the process is how you handle quality assessment. And I'm going to direct that to Nicola. You know, in your experience, is handling quality assessment a separate process from data extraction? Is it part of the data extraction process? What's your experience on how to integrate that into the process?
Yeah, I mean, I've always included quality assessment as part of that data extraction phase. I mean, for me personally and for the teams I've worked in, we've tended to find it easier once you're reading a study, you're digesting a study, you're really thinking about it, to work on the quality assessment at the same time. I mean, there's different aspects of the quality assessment that you can only answer after you've extracted the data, to know whether there's like missing data or selective outcome reporting, that kind of thing. So for me personally, I would tend to do it alongside the data extraction so that my mind is focused on one study. But that's really like a decision that you may decide to do it separately, because there is, again, that separate process of making sure that all your reviewers are making the judgments in the same way around those areas. So again, that's something to think about when you're piloting too, and in your protocol actually, having a decision matrix on how you approach your quality assessment can be really useful.
I've always done it after the extraction of the study characteristics and the outcomes. I mean, you certainly would never, I think, do it before, but I find that when I've completed my data extraction, I feel really familiar with the study. And when I've done all the studies, I feel really familiar with the overview of what's going on across studies. And then the quality for me follows on afterwards. And I think it's a really good point that you need to pilot that too. So I do tend to pilot that separately actually from the standard extraction of data.
And so I've got a follow-up question from myself about that. So when you say that in terms of the context, so when you're thinking about quality assessment, will you be thinking about the quality of a particular paper in the context of the larger process, that as you're working through them, that you'll be thinking that some of them are better quality than others, and that will shape your decisions around quality assessment for a specific paper in terms of the set of papers that you're looking at?
No, I don't. I don't think of it in those terms. I just think of it as, you know, I know what I'm dealing with now, but I don't make judgments like that. I think another reason that I tend to do quality assessments separately is that when I do dual data extraction, I may do that with one co-author, and then the data extraction for the quality assessment I may do with another co-author. So I find it useful to separate those processes. But it's really, there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just a matter of sort of preference and what flows best for you and your team.
Okay. Yeah, I also wanted to mention under this point about documenting everything, which is something I haven't touched on yet, is that systematic reviews are intended to be updated every few years, whether it's by you or perhaps another author team coming in to update it. So I would say that documenting decisions is hugely important. I've worked on many updates where even updates of reviews I've done myself, where it hasn't always been clear how we made decisions, or certainly coming, you know, into another review that other authors have worked on. It's so helpful if there's a place. I would probably recommend maybe doing a table in the appendices to your review, so that you have all the information together, and just to add to it as you go along. Once you've done your consensus, if decisions have been made, put it in that table, keep a record of it. It's just going to really help you out, even with peer review comments later down the line, just to remind yourself how you came to decisions. And I would also mention with documenting is version control. You want to know what your final consensus data is, so that when you are doing your analysis, you have one place where you'll know that the data is finalized and correct, and have that all in one place.
Yes, that's an excellent point. Version control is critical in my experience as well. I am going to I'm going to pass along one question from participants that I think is a key question that comes up, particularly at this point in the process, and that is, can we keep revising our original plan during the data extraction?
Well, I think you want to avoid that if possible, but if you find something that you need to revise, then you have to do it and document it.
Yeah, I would agree with Susan. I wouldn't think it would be ideal to keep chopping and changing. I mean, this is why piloting is a great idea. Maybe even thinking about sort of looking at an important key study on the topic whilst you're writing your protocol. So really just having that sense and that of it before you get started. So ideally you'd want to avoid that, but as Susan says, if it's something important, yes, you need to change it.
Okay.
And then back again to piloting, I see there's a question about how long it would take to do data extraction of around 20 studies. And that's something else that you probably would get a good sense of when you do your pilot, because it really depends on how much information you're extracting, how difficult it is to sort of make sense of it, and how much experience you and your co-authors have in performing the data extraction. So nobody can really give you an answer. That's something you need to sort of figure out for yourself. And it can be tricky to estimate, you know, how much time you'll need. But the pilot will help you figure out what it is you'll really need and how close your prior estimate might be to the truth.
Mm.
Well, that's a beautiful segue into tip 4, which is allow enough time. And this is something that we hear, that I think we all have, everyone on this panel has experience with ourselves, and that we certainly hear from other teams and throughout our community, is to allow yourself enough time for the data extraction process, and that the whole process, but particularly this part of the process, is likely to take longer than you think. So I'm going to ask Nicola the first question. As someone who has previous experience with actually doing systematic reviews as your job, what's your experience with estimating how much time you're likely to need, and how has that sort of tracked with reality?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question to answer. It does depend on so many factors. I mean, one key factor is going to be how many studies have you included. So that really is so dependent on the topic area you're doing, how broad your question is as well. And if you're the more focused your question is, the fewer studies you're going to get. The broader it is, the more you'll have. So that's something to bear in mind, depending on maybe you're doing it for a course and you only have a very, very absolute amount of time. So you might want to think about that when developing your protocol in the first place. I would think that one thing that is quite easy to overlook when you're planning out your timeline for review, it's quite easy to think of it as search, screen, data extraction, analyze, write up. But what you would be missing in that is factoring in the time it takes to do that pilot, develop your data extraction forms, re-edit those data extraction forms after the pilot. So that's a really important stage to add to your timeline. As well as, you may have studies that have multiple reports of the same study. Perhaps they're reporting in different regions in the study or different time periods. So if you've got a complicated subject like that has many multiple studies for multiple reports of one study, you're going to need to factor in that that's going to take you longer to get through. And then you also need to think about whether you need to contact authors, get extra information from them. Yeah, and also organizing and cleaning that data for your analysis. So that's a stage I think that can often as well get overlooked, is you've got your data in your extracted forms, but now you need to make sure that you have got it in a format that's going to work for your analysis. So do make sure you just account for those times as well.
Okay, thank you. And Susan, follow up is for you. What happens? How do you handle with unanticipated changes to the schedule? You need to get more information from authors, consult with colleagues, etc. How do you handle that in terms of managing the schedule and the process?
Yeah, so I would go back to the first tip, which is to have a plan, because first of all, you try to prevent these unanticipated changes by planning ahead around the things you do know about. So you probably have an idea of approximately how many studies you'll include. You'll know how complex your question is. You want to include all the aspects of the process, like Nicola said. You're going to, not just, you're going to include the piloting, for example, and you're going to include the step of getting your data extraction into your sort of final manuscript in your analysis software, which is something we haven't really discussed, but definitely can take time. And then you want to come up with an overall timeline, check that your colleagues are available when you expect them to be available. And you want to err on the side of generosity in estimating the amount of time you're going to need for all these things. Plan to set aside more time than you think you'll need. And then I would say be firm in communicating deadlines and expectations, even with the authors that you contact to get additional information. My first contact, I will just contact them. My second contact, which I rarely actually need to have a second contact, because most authors are pretty interested in sort of collaborating and getting their study information into a systematic review. But on the second contact, I might say something like, please get back to me within 2 weeks, name a date so that I can use this data. And again, you need to be very firm in communicating with your colleagues what your expectations are. So not just we're going to extract data until it's done, but we're aiming to complete our data extraction by such and such a time, and ideally by such another time, even sooner. And if possible, choose to work with people you trust to be responsive and conscientious. So in my experience, I mostly work with volunteer authors, and we don't have firm deadlines, so it is really hard to work to deadlines, or sort of be able to control a lot of these processes, because people are not getting paid money. And it's much more important, but also more controllable when you have a firm deadline, because there's a contract or an academic deadline or something like that. So I will just say that it happens even at this stage with a dozen, 2 dozen reviews, that you will come across glitches like this, and that you just have to sort of expect them and plan around them. So for some reason, I didn't realize on my current review that 2 of my co-authors should be taking a 1-week leave during June. And so that, that was my fault, and it put me behind a little bit where I would have ideally liked to be. But, we're catching up now. And there's a lot that you can't control. So sometimes people may have family or health issues, or there may be a pandemic. I mean, there's a limit to what you can control.
Yeah, you may also have delays around getting hold of published reports as well, if they're not freely available online, or your library needs to find it for you. That can add time as well.
Yeah.
We have a follow-up question that's related to that, which is, how do you decide between contacting authors for more information or searching for or reviewing other publications from the author to get the needed information, including publications that are not in the review sample?
I think you always want to make sure that you've found every published paper that is being published about the study that you're including. So if they refer to them within their paper that you've found, make sure that you're going off and finding those ones as well. I think that's really important.
Okay.
And then if there's not information in those additional papers, you might want to contact the authors. And often in a protocol, you'll pre-specify that you will contact authors for information about key study characteristics, or about, the primary outcome. You wouldn't contact the authors for every little question you might have, but really reserve it for the important information that you're missing.
Okay. Thank you. And now on to our 5th and final tip, which is that there's a lot to understand. We've already covered quite a lot of information, and getting some advice, mentoring, support from someone who's done this before, who has experience, is really helpful and quite important to a lot of people, particularly the first time that they're doing a review. So I'm actually going to post the final poll question. This is something that we're interested in to find out from you. If you're doing a review as part of your curriculum, or if this is something you've decided to undertake yourself, do you have an instructor, a mentor? Do you have someone providing support? And I've provided a couple of different options there for you to give us your information, or if you're doing this on your own, essentially, without any training or support. So I'm going to ask Susan, who's been involved in this kind of work for a long time, to talk a little bit about who was helpful to you when you first started learning about this process.
So yeah, I think it's really interesting when you think about the systematic review as a whole process, that there is a lot of support out there around developing your question, and there's a lot of support around searching for studies and conducting analyses, and choosing what model you're going to use and how to approach heterogeneity and things like that. There's actually relatively little support around data extraction. And so I just learned from people that I worked with in the early years, and I was fortunate that some of them, I think, were really good at what they did. And so I sort of adapted their models and just experience. But it would be great if there were a more structured way to approach this so that people could get mentoring or instruction that helps them get through this actually sort of unacknowledged but quite important and lengthy part of the systematic review process. So I can't say I had an ideal experience, but just essentially some good role models and a lot of muddling through.
Nicola, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, again, I was fortunate to work with some quite experienced systematic reviewers in my early years of doing this, so that really really helped me get on the right track with doing data extraction. Yeah, but I agree that it's a shame because the data that you actually are extracting from your studies, this is fundamental to your review and your findings, and it's a hugely important part of the process.
And I've posted the poll results, and so it's heartening to see that most people that have responded to this are getting some type of training or support in how to do this process. But about 25% of the people that have responded to this poll have not received any training or support. And Nicola, this last follow-up question is for you. Are there any other possible options that you're aware of for people who don't have access readily to training or support or mentoring? Are there other options out there that people can find in addition to, self-training resources? But are there resources for actually finding some kind of mentoring or peer-to-peer support?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any specific services for that, but what I would encourage people to do is definitely reach out to even your peers, maybe on the same course or at the same university as you, just to feel that you're not completely alone in the process. There's many people working on these and you're all facing very similar challenges. So even if they've just a bit further along in the process, or maybe they've done one before, they're going to have a lot of helpful information for you and a lot of experience. It's a steep learning curve with systematic reviewing, so I would encourage you to reach out to others that are in the same situation, for sure.
And one thing I would also add from my own experience is that is to keep an eye on what's happening on social media. Certainly in communicating with people in the Covidence community and social media, I've come across multiple hashtags or communities where people are sharing information and advice. PhD chat is a good example of where lots of people are talking to each other about the processes of what they're doing. And that will often include work that they're doing that's relevant to the kind of work that Covidence supports, because they will talk to each other about what they're doing, and they may name tag us, which gives us a glimpse of what's happening in those conversations. So that's something to think about as well if you don't have access to a local community, or you might be separated from your local community at this point, that may be a place to get some information or support. Okay, so that wraps up our top 5 tips. And we've got a couple of minutes left. We're coming pretty close to the end of the hour. So we have, I've posted a summary again of the top 5 tips, and I have pulled out a few additional questions from the list that came through with reference to the tips as we've gone through them. So the first one I'm going to ask is to either Susan or Nicola or both of you. That someone had asked if, is there any kind of standard percentage when doing a pilot? Is there any kind of standard percentage that you suggest people aim for, or is it really dependent upon the situation that you're in?
I mean, I think 10% is usually a good place to start.
Okay. All right. That's a good number to aim for.
I would say, it also depends on how your pilot goes. You may need to continue revising and piloting, but yeah, I think 10%, that's pretty much in accord with what I've done in the past.
Okay, and then going back to discussions about piloting and documentation, someone's written in to ask, can I use different data extraction forms for different included studies, or should I be using identical data extraction forms for all the studies included in my review?
I mean, I think you would want a standard data extraction form. I mean, when you get to the point of outcomes, different studies are probably going to report on different outcomes. So that's where you might find there's some variability. You wouldn't necessarily need to fill that out if they didn't have the information, but I would try and keep it as standardized as possible for sure.
Okay.
Definitely.
And, anything to add to that, Susan?
Oh, just that, you know, if you're going to be systematic and you're going to have a plan, you're really going to want to standardize as much as possible. It's going to make it, you know, a lot easier and more efficient to collect the data and then to make use of it. So you really do want to have standardized format, and then you may have to take in, so you may have to collect information in different formats. So you may have to collect age as a range from one study and mean and standard deviation from another study. But, you know, you may want to have extra fields or a place where you store data that's different or allows some flexibility, but you're always going to want to have the same items collected in as standardized a fashion as possible.
Okay. And the final question I think we're going to have time for is, we actually had this from a couple of different people, and that was about some of the terminology we used earlier, and that was it was to talk a little bit more about what we're referring to when we talk about quality assessment, and is that the same thing as risk of bias? If we can provide a little bit more information on what we're thinking about when we talk about quality assessment as a term. So Susan, I'm gonna ask you.
Yes, quality
first,
assessment, I think is more properly, at least in Cochrane reviews, it's considered risk of bias assessment, because you're not assessing the quality of the study as such. You're assessing what the risk is of having a biased information from the study. So it is risk of bias. Cochrane risk of bias tool, which has been recently revised, provides a guide for what to look at and how to assess it. You may also want to assess other things that you think are important for quality, so or you know, risk of bias, so that's kind of controversial things about funding, or conflicts of interest, sort of affiliation biases. I would extract those as part of the standard data extraction, and look at quality or risk of bias as a standard tool that you're using actually to look at risk of bias.
Okay, Nicola, anything to add to that?
No, I think Susan covered that well.
Okay. Okay, well, we've got about 2 minutes left before the hour is up, so I'm going to wrap this discussion up at this point, and I'm going to give you a little bit more practical information to everyone who's attended. You will receive a recording of the webinar about 24 hours after the conclusion of this presentation. And we have had other questions that we haven't been able to answer, and we've had people asking for things like some practical examples and some illustrative examples of the things we've been talking about. So we will be following up this presentation and discussion with some additional resources that we'll be developing, and we'll try to include some concrete examples that might be useful to people who may be looking for that kind of information. So that concludes today's session. I'd like to thank everyone who attended today and contributed to the discussion, and special thanks to Susan and Nicola for sharing their knowledge and experience. And please stay safe, everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your day, however much of it is left wherever you are. Thank you.